Camus tells us very simply, I can say I know the world inside out, as you may see. Speaking in Theroux's voice, this is Theroux. I can say I know the world inside out, as you may see, that each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. And I know, too, that we must keep endless watch on ourselves, lest in a careless moment we breathe in somebody's face and fasten the infection on him. What's natural is the microbe. All the rest, health, integrity, purity, if you like, is a product of the human will, of a vigilance that must never falter. The good man, the man who infects hardly anyone, is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention. And it needs tremendous willpower, a never-ending tension of the mind, to avoid such lapses. Yes, Ryu, it's a wearying business being plague-stricken, but it's still more wearying to refuse to be it. That's page 253. Such a powerful passage. He says what's natural is the microbe. And I'm reminded of James Hollis, the Jungian analyst, and former director of the Jung Center, who talks about nature naturing. Life depends on death. The black beans and rice that I ate for lunch were not animals, but they were living. And their death was necessary for me to live. So too, the pigs that gave me the bacon and the pork roast I ate and the kale and so on. Death is an inextricable part of life. What is natural is the microbe. What is natural is the coronavirus. Or we can't understand it as being anything. We can't, how do I say this? A vision of the natural world that includes all that we usually romanticize, sentimentalize, and genuinely cherish has to include the coronavirus. He goes on to say, this is Theroux, I say there are pestilences and there are victims. No more than that. If by making that statement I too become a carrier of the plague germ, at least I don't do it willfully. I try, in short, to be an innocent murderer. You see, I have no great ambitions. I grant we should add a third category, that of the true healers. But it's a fact one doesn't come across many of them, and anyhow it must be a hard vocation. That's why I decided to take, in every predicament, the victim's side, so as to reduce the damage done. Among them, I can at least try to discover how one attains to the third category. In other words, to peace. It was on page 254. There are two categories. There are pestilences and there are victims. That is all. He gives us this image, which I'd love to hear us talk about in discussion, of being an innocent murderer. What does it mean to be an innocent murderer? By knowing oneself to carry death within us. We know it now in the pandemic, as we're being told that we need to wear masks when we go to the store so that we can keep whatever we may have within us. We may not make others sick. We know now that what is aerosolized when we sneeze, when we breathe, can be really dangerous to others, can make us murderers or the agents of death. How can we become innocent murderers? By accepting the truth of who we are as participants in nature and working as hard as we can not to bring it about consciously, right? Those deaths consciously. So he says he has a third category here, pestilences, victims, and healers. And this is Theroux's goal is to attain peace. We go in just a little bit further. This is directly from the text. After a short silence, the doctor raised himself a little in his chair and asked if Teru had an idea of the path to follow for attaining peace. Yes, he replied, the path of sympathy. I'm going to keep reading and then circle back here. He says, "It comes to this," Teru said almost casually. "What interests me is learning how to become a saint." "But you don't believe in God." "Exactly. Can one be a saint without God? That's the problem. In fact, the only problem I'm up against today." Teru knows he's not a healer. He wants to be a saint. And the path to this kind of peace, he says, is sympathy. I think it's worth taking a moment to wonder what might be meant here by sympathy. And I absolutely don't speak as a French translator or an authority on this translation or a Camus scholar. We spend time now increasingly making distinctions, and I think important ones, between sympathy and empathy and compassion. And I wonder here if what Teru is talking about is something that we might translate differently, that we might translate as compassion. Let's assume for our purposes that sympathy is an imagining oneself into somebody else's circumstances and having a sense, an intellectual sense of what they might be experiencing. That empathy is where we feel what they are feeling, that we have our own sympathetic reaction within us, empathetic reaction that brings about the emotion, the feeling that this other person is experiencing. And that compassion involves an empathy that stays with the other and witnesses and suffers with, which is what compassion means, to suffer with, and works to help and works to heal. And something tells me, although Teru is a pretty intellectual fellow, that he means more than what we mean by sympathy. He understands this to mean to involve feeling as well. Ryu responds here. He says, I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man. So here's more. So here we hear the word heroism come back. The idea of being a singular human being who is sacrificing himself for the good of others in a very direct, deliberate way. And he's connecting sainthood with this notion of heroism. But it's, I think, a little bit more complicated than that, and we'll get to this in a moment. What Ryu says is, what interests me is being a man. We have the path of the saint in Teru. We have the path of the healer in Ryu. And for Ryu, being a healer means being a man, being fully human, not being an exception. Being closer to the rest of humanity and what they struggle with and what they feel. Sort of can come to the end of this passage, and we have this great moment in the narrative, and it's powerful because of how little it's been present, which is a moment of relaxation, of pause, of affection between these two characters. Teru says, "It's too damn silly living only in and for the plague. Of course, a man should fight for the victims, but if he ceases caring for anything outside that, what's the use of his fighting?" So in this moment, finally, we have Camus suggesting there might be something other than fighting for the common good, which I have to say I'm relieved by. So that's most of what this book is about on some level. Of course, a man should fight for the victims, but if he ceases caring for anything outside that, what's the use of his fighting? I think I've mentioned in these videos, one of the things I spend a good bit of my time doing is presenting on self-care and burnout to people who are in the social service professions and activists and mental health providers, and I've been doing work with the public health folks. And this is one of the interesting parts of the research, is that human rights activists who are people who are drawn to doing refugee work and human rights work, that there are a couple of different, there are two chief factors in burnout. One of them, of course, is secondary trauma, so it's exposure to trauma stories by the people that the trauma stories of the people they're working on behalf of. They also the other factor is perfectionism. It's a belief that that I am the only person who can accomplish this, and if I don't give everything to the cause, then all will be lost. And so they identify people who tend to be more perfectionistic burn out of the work more quickly. So it's nice to hear them say there's something more than fighting for the victims, because there has to be, just as a basic truth of human functioning. And we're going to get a little bit more of a picture of that here in a moment with him. So they go swimming together. Taru brings Ryu along and says, hey, you know what? Let's use this small bit of privilege that we have, because we have badges that allow us to go places that others can't. Let's go for a swim. No one's going to bother us. And they have this small, beautiful moment where they're just out together in the water. And this is the last piece I'll quote from the text in this section. Ryu could feel under his hand the gnarled, weather-worn visage of the rocks, and a strange happiness possessed him. Turning to Taru, he caught a glimpse on his friend's face of the same happiness, a happiness that forgot nothing, not even murder. I think this is where Camus ends the story of happiness in this book, and where I do too. It's such a poignant phrase, a happiness that forgot nothing, not even murder. This is a happiness that happens in the context of emotional honesty, and carries with it a willful intention not to escape the bare facts of human suffering. And it's also affirming of the experience of connection and happiness amidst suffering. It is okay to feel connection and joy. Karen Waldman, who's I've gotten to know recently through the Houston Coalition Against Hate, is writing a book on activism and joy, which I think is fantastic, because so often we are driven by this sober need to change and a righteous anger, and what she's trying to do is point our attention to the fact that actually other feelings are possible too, and are necessary in order to sustain us. We're not guilt. We shouldn't feel guilt, right? We shouldn't feel guilt for living the lives that we lead. A life that is not able to forget the reality of murder, right? The reality of human suffering can include other feelings too.